Dan Slott's The Clone Conspiracy is one of the worst comics I have ever read, and the damage it did to Spider-Man comics as a whole cannot be understated. Do I have your attention? Good. This is not going to be a happy video. It's not going to be one that's hopeful for the future. I'm simply going to lay it out there that this comic sucks, and I'm going to get into real graphic detail as to why I hate one very particular part of it. You see, during Dan Slott's run of The Amazing Spider-Man, 10 long, dark years for the character that include a lot of mischaracterization and downright bad stories, Dan decided that in the middle of his Peter Parker becomes a tech billionaire CEO storyline to bring back a fan-favorite character who'd long since been out of the spotlight. Now this run, this 10-year run, was bad. Just a downright stinker. But people for some reason give it a pass, because hey, Superior Spider-Man, he's cool, right? Well, he's not. At all. Superior Spider-Man is wildly overrated, but that's for another day. Right now, I'm going to explain to you, my dear true believers, about the time Dan Slott had Ben Reilly brutally tortured and executed over 20 times in a single comic. For reasons. Basically, the comic opens with Peter finding out about some people being hospitalized for cellular degeneration, the same kind he saw quite a lot of during the infamous 90s Clone Saga. So of course, he starts getting clone PTSD and commits corporate espionage to find out what's going on. And his trail takes him right to the New U Industries, where he finds Miles Warren, better known as the Jackal, back on his cloning bullshit. And yet another alive Gwen Stacy. Because we really can't let this character go, despite decades of character development for Peter Parker and his relationship with Mary Jane. Oh, and of course, she's once again wearing the clothes she died in. Because let's be real with ourselves. Gwen Stacy has become so far removed from the minds of actual comic readers over the years that her outfit is genuinely more iconic than any action the character ever made in her entire history. But sure, let's make her a Spider-Sona and shove her into every single Spider-Man team-up event we can get our hands on. Gotta get that Gwen content somehow, eh, Marvel? Slott then tries his hand at completely ruining even more Spider-Man history by revising and retconning the entire battle with the Green Goblin over the Brooklyn Bridge, to now have Gwen actually conscious for the entire fight. Which means she finds out that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, possibly killed her dad, Captain George Stacy, and finally, dies, hating Peter as much as she hated the web-slinger. We even get her final thoughts up to the moment her neck snaps. Because that's definitely something we needed, Dan. And that's just the beginning, folks. This comic is so weirdly mean-spirited and grossly written. I have no idea how Slott got this past anyone at editorial. Then again, I've long since believed that this man has got to have some dirt on someone high up for how many books and ideas he gets to worm his way into. It's like no one's allowed to tell him no. It puts a bad taste in my mouth every time I see his name on a Spidey book. Anywho, Gwen then wakes up in a cloning vat, talks to a guy in a Jackal mask who definitely isn't Ben Reilly, and then she finds out she's not even a clone. She's the real deal. Yeah, so Clone Conspiracy had this weird idea that those brought back with the New U devices weren't clones. They really were the original people brought back to life. And even Lady Death herself confirmed it in Peter David's Scarlet Spider run. But it really goes back and forth depending on the writer. You see, some characters who originally died in older Marvel stories remained alive in the aftermath of the Clone Conspiracy, including Ned Leeds and Ashley Kafka. But they're treated like clones and not the originals, despite Ben and Death herself clearly stating that they're reanimated, not cloned. It's weird, and I totally understand better writers deciding not to touch Slott's ideas with a 10-foot pole. But still, consistency would be nice. I'm not going to get into much more detail since the comic is long and awful. But yada yada, stuff happens, there's a big fight with Rhino, Doc Ock, and Electro, and then we get to the big reveal. The guy in the Jackal mask is Ben Reilly, and he's not blonde anymore. Surprise! And he launches into his tortured backstory that definitely made him an evil bad guy for this event. Despite the fact that Ben Reilly's whole thing during the Clone Saga was that despite him having a tortured backstory that definitely could and should have turned him into a villain, he instead rose above it and became an even better hero. It was inspiring. And of course, Dan Slott had to tear it all down. So let's go ahead and jump on over to Ben Reilly's death during the Clone Saga finale, thanks to the newly resurrected Norman Osborn, and one very pointy glider. Ben, who at this point believes that he's the real one and Peter's the clone, still chooses to sacrifice himself for the clone. Why? Because that clone is his brother. Because that clone has a wife and a baby on the way. Because Ben Reilly has long since come to understand that, clone or not, you're still a human being. Same goes for Kane. At this point in his life, the whole clone nonsense doesn't matter to him. So to him, it's a fine death. He died for his brother. And we find out not long after from a character with low-level psychic abilities who'd run across Ben during his time as Spider-Man, that in Ben's final moments, he was okay. That his last thoughts were of Peter. That he was glad to have known him. And how much their friendship meant to him. It's bittersweet. I hate that Ben had to die to satisfy editorial. But at the same time, I'm glad to know that his final act of sacrifice was for his brother, and it came from the heart, and it was remembered as such for a long time after. But once again, Slott had decided to worm his way in and totally retcon that away to make room for his bastardization of the character. Because that's Dan Slott's motto, folks. If the continuity doesn't fit the story you want to tell, just change the continuity, no matter how much damage that does to past writers' stories. I mean, just look at how much he plunders JMS's work for his terrible Spider-Verse comics. So, instead of Ben being glad to die for his brother, instead he's all, "Oh no, I'm the clone. Wah!" Instead to have some villain motivation. You know, despite the fact that with all the back and forth of the Clone Saga, there is not a chance in hell Ben wouldn't just shrug his shoulders and say, fair enough, if he found out he was the clone again by that point in the 90s. It then cuts to Miles Warren, now somehow alive again for reasons, picking the exact spot where Peter left Ben's rotting, dusty corpse to steal his remains in the aftermath of the Green Goblin attack on the Daily Bugle. You know, despite the fact that Peter clearly takes Ben's ashes to scatter them over the Brooklyn Bridge in the original story. Once again, Dan Slott just loves continuity. Ben wakes up in a cloning tube, Miles Warren gives his big villain speech that I don't give a shit about, and then he brutally electrocutes Ben to death for shits and giggles. If it wasn't clear by now that Slott has definitely got some deep-rooted hatred for Ben Reilly, it'll become crystal clear in a moment. Warren then decides to drown Ben, which our hero very nearly breaks out of, but because of plot reasons, Ben can't, because the power of friendship simply doesn't work on clones. Ben thinks of everyone who's counting on him to make it out, which for some reason doesn't include any of Ben's actual supporting cast members, just Peter's. You know, Shirley and her son, Kane, Jessica, Janine, Desiree, Jimmy, Peter himself, Mary Jane. Just, it makes no sense to me that he'd be thinking of Harry Osborn and J. Jonah Jameson at this moment, especially since Harry was dead at this point. Given who he just died for, I'd say his thoughts would most definitely be on Peter, MJ, and the baby. But Ben's gotta die here, so he gets sad thinking that all those people love Peter more than him, and he loses his fighting spirit and gives in to drowning. Oh, but it doesn't stop there. Dr. Warren brings him back, then electrocutes him, gasses him, boils him, lights him on fire, melts him, and on and on and on. 27 deaths. Can you imagine hating a character so much that you have them killed off in your comic 27 times? A character who's already been dead for well over a decade at this point too? Imagine bringing them back just to do this to them. Just to do this to the fans of that character. All so you can have a shitty villain in your shitty comic that no one remembers for anything but the fact that it neatly brushed Zeb Wells' Shed story under the rug. And for those who don't know, that's the Marvel comic where Zeb Wells had the lizard eat his own son for shock value. He's now the lead writer on Spider-Man. Yeah. Ben Reilly is crying, begging Dr. Warren to just let him die. Who let this get through editorial? This is such a mean-spirited comic for no reason other than to spit in the face of fans who wanted a return for the character since it was lightly teased in Spider Island. But it all ends with Ben breaking out, going crazy, cloning Warren a bunch of times to mess with him, and him taking over the New You project to bring back everyone Peter had ever let die. And the whole event ends with him trying to murder Peter to take his place at the head of Parker Industries, and subsequently trying to destroy the entire world and become God or whatever. It's bad. It's a bad, bad comic, and I hate that I had to reread it for this video. But now you know. This is what the character went through, just for Zeb Wells and Nick Lowe to kick him back down right when it looked like they were building him back up to the hero he used to be in Spider-Man Beyond. I just want a win for this character. Please, Marvel. This is the Synth Voice Network, signing off for the night.